Have you ever felt like money just disappears from your hands? Even when you're sure you didn't spend on anything excessive? Like at the end of the month, something just doesn't add up and it starts to bother you in a way that's hard to explain. And even worse, have you noticed that sometimes when you finally manage to save a little money, instead of feeling relief, you feel a strange anxiety, as if it could vanish at any moment, and you stay on alert all the time, like you're about to lose everything suddenly. It sounds contradictory, because logic says that having money saved should bring security, but in practice, it often brings a constant fear that you can't quite explain. This happens because the problem for most people isn't just how much they earn or how much they spend, but how they see money. Because when you have nothing, there's no fear of losing it. But when you start to save a little, even if it's just a small amount, your brain changes completely. And instead of focusing on security, it starts focusing on the possibility of loss. And that makes you make confusing decisions, sometimes avoiding spending even on what's necessary, and other times doing the exact opposite, spending quickly out of fear that the money will disappear later. And this kind of behavior creates a cycle of emotional instability that prevents you from having clarity. The first big lesson that changes everything is understanding that money isn't just a number. It affects your emotions all the time. It triggers fear, insecurity, comparison, guilt, and even a sense of failure. And until you understand this, any attempt at organization will feel heavy, exhausting, and hard to maintain because you'll be fighting something you don't even fully realize. And that's why you need to stop treating money like an invisible enemy and start treating it as something you can understand. Because as long as it remains confusing, you'll always feel like you're losing control. When you receive your paycheck, for example, there's that momentary relief, like things are finally going to work out, but that relief doesn't last long. Because along with the money comes an invisible pressure, bills, responsibilities, commitments, and that constant question in your head of whether it will be enough until the end of the month. And then the cycle that many people live without realizing begins, spending to try to balance things out, cutting back to compensate, failing, blaming yourself, promising that next month will be different, and repeating everything all over again. And the most dangerous part of this isn't just the financial impact, but the mental exhaustion it creates, because you start to feel like you're always trying and never getting anywhere. The second lesson comes in right here, because financial organization isn't about rigid control. It's not about living restricted or tracking every cent with suffering. It's about creating a system that works even when you're tired, because no one can rely on willpower all the time. And maybe you've tried to get organized before using apps, spreadsheets, or notes, but ended up giving up. Not because you lacked willpower, but because it became too heavy, too hard to maintain in daily life. And that happens because you tried to create discipline without creating structure. And without structure, every decision becomes an effort. And constant effort is exhausting. That's why you need to take decisions out of your hands whenever possible, automate what you can, split your money into parts, create simple paths so you don't have to decide everything all the time. Because when your money already comes with a minimum destination defined, when your bills are already organized, when there's a flow, your mind starts to rest. And when your mind rests, you start making better decisions without having to fight yourself all the time. And there's something even more subtle that gets in the way for many people, which is not looking at their own money, because avoiding checking your balance, avoiding adding up debts, or ignoring statements may feel like relief in the moment. But in practice, it only makes the problem worse. Because every time you avoid looking, you lose control. And when you lose control, small things start to grow without you noticing, like forgotten subscriptions, repeated expenses, accumulated installments. And when you finally decide to look, the situation is already bigger than it needed to be. So the third lesson is simple, but it requires courage. You need to look at your money even when it makes you uncomfortable, not to judge yourself, but to understand what's happening. Because when you turn the unknown into something concrete, you start to see paths to solutions, and that completely changes the way you deal with the situation. Another common mistake is treating any extra money as if it doesn't matter, like bonuses, leftovers, or unexpected amounts that end up being spent without planning. And this kind of behavior prevents any real progress, because that money could be used to break the cycle, since it wasn't committed to anything. And this is where the fourth lesson comes in, which is understanding that money without a destination always finds a way to disappear, no matter the amount. If you don't decide in advance what to do with it, the decision will be made on impulse. And impulsive decisions almost never benefit you. Many people also believe that to get organized, they need to cut everything you stop spending and live in an extremely restricted way. But that doesn't work in the long run because it creates frustration and leads to the opposite effect, where after a period of excessive control comes overindulgence, and this cycle of restriction and loss of control only makes the situation worse. And that's why the fifth lesson is understanding that you don't need to cut everything. You need to find a balance that works in your reality, where you can spend, but consciously and within limits that don't harm your stability. In addition, your environment influences you much more than you imagine, because being constantly exposed to consumption stimuli, social media, comparisons, and promotions makes your brain go into autopilot and start desiring things that you didn't even miss before. And this creates a silent pressure that leads to spending without you noticing. And this is the sixth lesson. Protecting your mind is also part of financial organization, because if you don't do that, you're constantly being pushed into decisions that aren't really yours. Another important point is understanding that financial exhaustion doesn't come only from a lack of money, but from thinking about money all the time, like a constant concern that never goes away. And this drains your mental energy, affects your mood, your decisions, and even your quality of life. And this is the seventh lesson. Reducing this weight doesn't depend on extreme effort, but on simplifying your financial life, creating fewer decisions and more structure. Because when you simplify, you can keep going. The eighth lesson completely changes the perspective, because the goal of organizing your financial life isn't just to have more money, but to have less worry, because there's no point in earning more if you remain lost, anxious, and out of control. While someone who has clarity, even with less, can have more peace of mind and security in daily life. The ninth lesson shows the importance of creating financial breathing room, even if it's small, because this buffer isn't just for emergencies, but to protect your mind, preventing small problems from turning into big crises, since without this margin, any difficulty becomes a huge problem, while with it everything becomes more manageable. And the 10th lesson closes this first part with something essential. You don't need to get everything right. You just need to stop repeating the same mistakes, because what really traps you isn't making mistakes, but continuing to make them in the same way without noticing. And the moment you start to see your patterns, you gain the possibility to change. Moving forward, it's important to understand that no one goes financially broke because of a single big decision, but because of several small decisions that seem harmless in daily life, like small expenses, manageable installments, or purchases justified emotionally. And the 11th lesson is precisely realizing that the problem isn't a single expense, but the automatic repetition of these behaviors. And to change that, you need to create small pauses before spending, questioning whether it's really necessary or just an emotional response. The 12th lesson warns about the danger of excessive control, because trying to be too rigid creates internal pressure that leads to a rebound effect, where after a period of restriction comes loss of control. And this isn't a lack of discipline, but a sign that the method isn't sustainable. And that's why the focus should be on light consistency, with small continuous actions instead of radical changes. The 13th lesson reinforces the importance of noticing progress, because without that awareness, you get discouraged and feel like you're not improving, even when small improvements are happening, and recognizing these advances is essential to maintaining motivation. The 14th lesson shows that you don't need to solve everything at once, because trying to deal with old problems at the same time creates overload and paralysis, while focusing on one thing at a time makes the process lighter and more sustainable. And finally, the 15th lesson sums it all up in a practical way. Simple decisions repeated every day have more impact than occasional big decisions, because consistency is what builds real results over time. And when you understand that, you start to break out of the automatic cycle and take control of your financial life in a gradual and sustainable way. If you made it this far, it means something resonated with you. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel to keep learning in a simple and straightforward way, and comment the word control, because that shows that you didn't just listen, but that you're ready to change your relationship with money for real.